slavery was widely practiced throughout the ancient world, and the exploitation of enslaved Africans fueled the growth and economies of the American colonies in the 17th and 18th centuries. After the American Revolution, the Declaration of Independence promised liberty for all men, but did not end slavery. Conflict over the institution eventually drove the young nation into civil war. 9 facts about the transatlantic slave trade. From the role of women to its global scope, here are some lesser-known facts about the transport and enslavement of African people. The Atlantic slave trade constituted one of the worst crimes against humanity in recorded history. Over the course of 4 centuries, a cruel and thriving economy developed around enslaving and transporting millions of African people across the Atlantic Ocean, known as the Middle Passage. Here are 9 lesser-known facts about slave trade. 1. The Atlantic slave trade was the largest oceanic forced migration in history. Humans have a long history of slave trading, often over vast distances, but nothing has rivaled the Atlantic slave trade in size. Between the early 1500s and the 1860s, slave traders forced some 12.5 million men, women, and children aboard transatlantic slave ships on Africa's shores. This number does not include the millions more who died during the journey from the interior to the coast or who perished before a slave ship arrived to carry them away. 2. Triangle trade is only partially accurate. Most of us learned in school that slave ships followed a triangular route from Europe, Africa, the Americas, and back to Europe. But major variations existed. Thousands of voyages began in the Americas, continued to Africa, and returned to the Americas. The Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, Luanda, Angola, Rio de Janeiro journey formed the largest single route in the entire slave trade. Other voyages originated in U.S. ports like Newport, Rhode Island, and Charleston, South Carolina, and brought captives to the Americas on their return. 3. Many slave traders were women. While most slave traders were men, hundreds of women invested in the trade, according to slavivoyage.org. In Britain, France, and the Netherlands, widows of slave-trading husbands commonly took over their investments. One of the last ever slave traders, American Mary Watson, dispatched her own ships from New York in the 1850s and early 1860s. After Abraham Lincoln's administration shut down the slave trade in the U.S., Watson attempted to establish a new base in Spain in 1862 but died of tuberculosis. 4. Enslaved people fought the slave trade. Captives endured tremendous violence and trauma during the Atlantic crossing. According to slavivoyage.org, an estimated 15% died. Slave traders did everything in their power to prevent their captives from fighting back, arming themselves and shackling their human cargo. But captives resisted. Rebellions occurred on at least 10% of voyages, usually when ships were on or near the African coast. While they rarely succeeded, these revolts had a broader impact. By forcing slave traders to take extra precautions like increasing the number of sailors on board ships, rebels drove slave traders' costs higher and reduced the number of voyages put to sea. By some scholars' estimates, this prevented about 1 million captives from enduring the Middle Passage. 5. Slaves not only fought the slave trade, they helped end it. Books and movies often depict the anti-slavery movement as being led by political leaders like Britain's William Wilberforce. While such men played vital roles in the abolition of the slave trade, its earliest and most consistent opponents were enslaved people themselves. Their opposition proved crucial, as evidenced by the revolt that took place on the French Caribbean colony of Saint-Domingue, one of the largest destinations for slave ships in the 1700s. In the 1790s, enslaved people there rebelled against the institution of slavery and later against French colonial rule. And they won. By 1804, they had defeated France, and its leader Napoleon Bonaparte, and ensured that the slave trade and slavery itself would never be resurrected. They renamed their country Haiti, the name by which we know the country today. 6. The slave trade continued to flourish, even after countries legally banned it. By the late 1700s, many countries questioned the legitimacy of the slave trade. By the 1830s, every slave-trading nation in Europe and the Americas banned the traffic, either through international treaties or via their own national laws. But many powers, including Brazil and Spain, did so reluctantly and under diplomatic pressure. They had little intention of seriously enforcing their bans. The slave trade continued to produce profits. In fact, even more so in the 1800s, and traffickers paid large bribes to government officials to ignore their crimes. Most of the captives who endured the illegal slave trade in the 1800s went to Brazil and the Spanish island of Cuba. Many were transported under the American flag and on U.S.-built ships, which the U.S. authorities had little interest in policing. In total, slave traders smuggled 1.65 million captives aboard illegal slave ships in the 1800s, 13% of the entire slave trade, according to slavivoyage.org. The last slave ship to cross the Atlantic Ocean arrived in Cuba in the late 1860s. 7. The Atlantic slave trade was global. The Atlantic slave trade rippled out far beyond the Atlantic Ocean. European slave traders sourced fabrics from South Asia and cowrie shells from the Maldives in the Indian Ocean to trade for enslaved Africans. Parts of non-Atlantic Africa also participated in the slave trade. Some slave ships carried captives from Mozambique on Africa's eastern coast to the Americas. In some parts of the Americas, enslaved people mined metals like silver and gold, which slave owners sometimes traded to China. 8. The slave trade transformed the world. The slave trade radically changed lives, economies, environments, and cultures. First, of course, it devastated millions of enslaved people. In addition to the 1 to 2 million who died during the Middle Passage, survivors usually faced lifelong enslavement and hard labor in the Americas. The slave trade also reinforced racial hierarchies in the Americas and Europe that upheld the oppression of black people for centuries. Closely intertwined with capitalism, industrialization, and imperialism, the trade strengthened those economic and political systems, enriching enslavers and societies on both sides of the Atlantic. And it transformed ecosystems and environments, transporting invasive species like mosquitoes from Africa to the Americas and forcing enslaved people to clear trees to cultivate cash crops like sugar and cotton for global markets. On a cultural level, enslaved Africans made a huge mark on the Americas, unsurprising given the richness and extraordinary diversity of African cultures and the fact that more enslaved Africans crossed the Atlantic Ocean than Europeans until the 1820s. African influences permeate language, music, religion, food, and medicine across the Americas. 9. Enslaved people have stories to tell. Historians continue to gather information about captives and to tell their stories. New databases such as slavivoyage.org/past/database and enslaved.org contain names and other information about tens of thousands of enslaved people. One individual who has received lots of attention recently is Aluel Kasola, later known by the name Cudjoe Lewis, who has a remarkable story. Captured in 1860 by Dahomey warriors in modern-day Benin and brought to Alabama in 1860, Kasola journeyed aboard the Clotilda, the last slave ship to arrive in the United States. Kasola survived the Middle Passage and slavery in the American South before joining with fellow Clotilda captives and forming a new settlement called Africatown, Alabama. This town still exists today. How Sally Hemings and other enslaved people secured precious pockets of freedom. In navigating lives of privation and brutality, enslaved people haggled, often daily, for liberties small and large. In the power relationship between America's enslaved people and their enslavers, it's widely assumed that the planter class held all the cards. After all, they were the dominant group who frequently enforced their will with whips, chains, dogs, and worse. Most enslaved people were considered little more than legal property, business investments whose human needs and family relationships were relevant only as far as they affected productivity and the bottom line of the people they served. So when faced with the question of whether enslaved people could negotiate any aspect of their lives with their enslavers, the prospect seems hard to imagine. With power stacked so overwhelmingly against them, what could the enslaved negotiate for and with what leverage? How could an enslaver concede even small favor to one, while maintaining fear and order among the broader ranks? The reality was complicated. In navigating lives of privation and brutality, enslaved people haggled, often daily, for liberties small and large, from rare personal time to less harsh treatment for themselves or family members, even to being set free. The case of Sally Hemings and America's third president Thomas Jefferson shines a light on this little-discussed aspect of America's peculiar institution. Hemings' story is an extraordinary one since it chronicles not only a 16-year-old enslaved girl who had the life experience and presence of mind to negotiate for her unborn children's future freedom, but a founding father whose complex moral code moved him to honor his agreement with a woman he enslaved for decades. Sally Hemings knew the value of women's bodies. Hemings was Jefferson's concubine, a woman who bore him 6 children, of whom 4 survived. Hemming's role was to attend to Jefferson's clothing in his chamber, which probably brought her into the main house often and in very close proximity to Jefferson and his bed. According to written accounts from their son Madison, Hemmings accompanied the Jeffersons to France starting in 1787, when she was 14 years old. There she enjoyed certain privileges and saw the kind of freedom she wanted for herself and her future children. Thus, when Jefferson asked her to return with him to Virginia 2.5 years later, she refused. It was possible for an enslaved person residing in France to sue for their freedom, since American slavery laws were not recognized or upheld there. It's unclear whether Hemmings' refusal was an overt bargaining chip or not, notes historian Annette Gordon Reed of Harvard, who has written extensively of the Jefferson-Hemmings relationship. Hemmings was 16 and pregnant with his child. But Jefferson made a solemn pledge to her that if she returned, she would be granted extraordinary privileges and their children would be freed at age 21. Madison Hemmings described their agreement as a treaty. Even as a young expectant mother, Hemmings understood the importance of her future increase, the term traders used in valuing unborn children. Childbearing mothers held different sets of monetary values than other women, based on their capacity to give birth to healthy children. Enslavers brokered deals for enslaved women based on projections of future breeding capacity. They questioned, examined, touched, and did all they could to determine whether they were purchasing fertile women. That Hemmings understood this at age 16 is not surprising. By age 5 or 6, most enslaved children had witnessed or even experienced family separation. Their parents often raised them to understand that their bodies were viewed as commodities, despite their humanity. Most young girls approaching puberty knew that their bodies were the focus of financial calculations, negotiations, and under-the-table deals. So Hemmings' response to Jefferson's proposal confirms that enslaved women and girls used what little leverage they had to carve out a better place for their future children. It's likely she knew that her own mother had made a similar calculation, having been engaged in a long-term concubine relationship with Jefferson's father-in-law John Wales. Hemmings was reportedly a half-sister to Jefferson's wife Martha, a fact that may have influenced his favorable treatment toward her. Navigating a life of slavery took resistance and negotiation. In order to understand the deal Hemmings struck with Jefferson nearly 230 years ago, it is useful to look at how other enslaved people negotiated small pockets of freedom within the institution, keeping in mind that the U.S. system of chattel slavery was in no way benign. Revolving as it did around crops, labor, land, domination, power and capital, it was an institution that exploited the labor and disrupted the families of those enslaved. Yet it was also an institution where people interacted with one another on a daily basis to discuss labor assignments, work incentives, food rations, disciplinary action, family visitation, geographic mobility, and a host of other topics. Enslaved people like Hemmings learned how to operate within the system's unending stream of delicate daily negotiations. Not that it was easy. They experienced few, if any, freedoms and barely any room to exercise their personhood. Enslavers used an array of violent and manipulative tactics to make people work for them, most commonly the whip and the threat of sale and family separation. Many enslaved people resorted to acts of resistance, large and small. They liberated themselves by running away, they faked ignorance to avoid certain kinds of work, they broke tools and stole weapons, they took food to supplement meager diets, they became literate to write passes. Some turned to violence, rebellion, arson, poisoning and even murdering those who kept them in bondage. But they also had direct transactional conversations with their enslavers and overseers, where they negotiated to carve out precious moments of liberty with the hopes of eventually becoming free. The complex leverage of concubines. Among the most complicated relationships during slavery were the intimate ones between enslaved women and their white enslavers. These relations ran the gamut from rape and sodomy to romance, from chance encounters to obsession, concubinage and even marriage, notes Brenda E. Stevenson, a professor of history at University of California, Los Angeles. For the most part, scholars refer to the enslaved women in these relationships as concubines. Often described as attractive mixed-race women who planters saw as desirable, many worked in the domestic realm, wore finer clothing than most enslaved women and experienced their first sexual encounter as a result of this relationship. History has recorded the names of many such women forced to be concubines, among them, Sally Hemings and her mother Elizabeth Hemings, Karina Omohundro, Elizabeth Ramsey and her daughter Louisa Piquet, Julia Dixon and Elizabeth Keckley. Some shared their experiences in narratives, while other stories appear in the autobiographies of relatives or were buried in the private papers of their enslavers. In North Carolina, Harriet Jacobs became one white man's concubine, hid in a tiny attic garret for 7 years and fled to the North, all to avoid being sexually exploited by her enslaver and to keep her children out of slavery. She later published a book called Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, becoming a prominent abolitionist and one of the first people to publicly broach the topic of sexual harassment of enslaved women. We cannot know whether or not these exchanges were consensual, but we do know that enslaved women were usually the property of the men who exploited them, and this fact alone complicates our interpretation of this history. It's hard to ignore the power dynamic involved, the often significant age gap, the sometimes incestuous connections, or the varying social status of all people involved in these connections. It's even difficult to find appropriate nouns to describe them. Unions and relationships seem presumptuous while interactions and exchanges seem benign, given that many concubines were sexually abused. But despite the inherent power imbalance, some enslaved women used these forced interactions to find a better space for themselves, or secure freedom for their offspring. Some might have entered, assuming they could go into these unions in order to escape the auction block, the field, or other workspaces. But could enslaved women enter such relationships? Did they have a choice? If they did, could they exercise it? What was their negotiation angle? Foremost was their capacity to bring new lives and laborers into the world. In an economy where black bodies were commodities, childbearing women were crucial economic multipliers. If they reliably added to their enslavers' net worth, perhaps they could earn small privileges for themselves and their family, such as time off to nurse newborns or care for sick children, or visit a family member at a nearby plantation. And concubines who bore children to their white enslavers could sometimes leverage those deeper familial connections to secure better situations for themselves and their offspring, such as relief from certain work assignments, the chance to be educated and eventually set free. However, enslaved women who tried to leverage this power, and these interactions, had varying degrees of success. And these strategies were not always premeditated, as many enslaved women dreaded the idea of motherhood and preferred not to bring children into a world of captivity. How 2 generations of concubines fared in their negotiations. For mother-daughter concubines Elizabeth Ramsey and Louisa Piquet, known to us through Piquet's 1861 published narrative, the hurdles were formidable. Elizabeth, owned by the Randolph family of South Carolina, found her negotiating powers superseded by the financial and personal challenges of the white families she served. When she gave birth to James Randolph's daughter Louisa, it did not take long for his white wife to figure out that the 2-week-old baby looked like her husband. Elizabeth and Louisa were quickly sold. Elizabeth, about 20 years old, then became concubine to her new owner, David Cook of Georgia, even though he too was married and had a family. Together, they produced 3 children. But after Cook incurred debts and lost his property, he sent his wife and children to live with relatives while he fled to Alabama with his concubine and her daughter. By the time Louisa was 14 years old, Cook forced himself on her. When she resisted, she suffered severe whippings. The family was separated and sold when Cook's debts caught up with him. Ramsey tried to negotiate for them to be purchased together, but she and her son were sold to an enslaver from Texas, while Louisa went to a Mr. Williams of Louisiana. Of the last goodbye, Louisa said her mother was right on her knees, with her hands up, praying to the Lord for me. She didn't care who saw her, the people all looking at her, knowing she would likely never see her daughter again. Mr. Williams, who was in his late 40s, let Louisa know right away that he intended to spend the rest of his life with her. She resisted and tried to negotiate with him, but he was relentless. Reflecting on this painful experience, she wished he would sell me, because I had no peace at all. I rather die than live in that way. But Williams got awful mad and said nothing but death should separate us, and if I run off, he'd blow my brains out. Louisa's life with Williams was so miserable, she longed for her mother and prayed for his death. When her second prayer was answered, she was freed and spent time trying to find her mother. Piquet moved to Ohio, married a mulatto man and became active in the church. She exchanged letters with her mother, who, she discovered, had been negotiating her own price so that Louisa could come to Texas and purchase her. In the first letter Louisa received, Elizabeth wrote, "Colonel Horton would let you have me for 1,000 dole. Or a woman that could fill my place. I think you could get one cheaper where you are that would fill my place than to pay him the money, I am anxious to have you to make this trade." As negotiations continued, Louisa wrote directly to her mother's enslaver, requesting he lower the price since Elizabeth was aging. He responded by telling Louisa that she had no bargaining power and that while Elizabeth was getting old, she carries her age well, and looks as young as she did 20 years ago. He did, however, volley back that he was willing to participate in a direct trade of another, enslaved woman, of her quality and qualifications in her stead. For nearly 2 years, the mother-daughter duo continued negotiating with Elizabeth's enslaver while Louisa went on a fundraising tour throughout Ohio and New York, seeking money to purchase her mother. At one point, Horton lowered Elizabeth's price to $900, but both women were heartbroken to learn that Louisa's brother John and Elizabeth's husband were not for sale. In the end, Louisa successfully completed the transaction and purchased her mother. The two were elated to be together, but disappointed that the family was not intact. The ultimate negotiation for liberty. No negotiation had higher stakes than when an enslaved person tried to buy themselves or their loved ones out of slavery. Unless an enslaver was desperately hard up for money, power lay squarely on her side and there was little an enslaved person could do to change the calculation. Several generations of the Hill family of Virginia, for example, spent their lives trying to purchase a release from bondage. After negotiating a price, John Hill's two uncles tried to pay their enslavers for their freedom, but they were shocked to learn that the enslavers had upped their price. Similarly daunting challenges faced another Virginia man named Dangerfield Newby, one of John Brown's black raiders on Harper's Ferry. Newby, who had himself been released from slavery by his white enslaver father, was trying to purchase his wife Harriet and their 7 children, who lived more than 50 miles away. Harriet appeared to have been trying desperately to broker a sale between her own enslaver and her newly freed husband. In a letter found on Newby's body when he died at Harper's Ferry, she was begging him, "I want you to buy me as soon as possible, for if you do not get me somebody else will. It is said master is in want of money, if so I know not what time he may sell me, and then all my bright hopes of the future, are blasted." Unfortunately, Dangerfield wasn't able to complete the transaction, having raised just over $740 of the $1,000 price for her and one child. She was sold after the raid. There were many documented cases of successful buyouts. But Newby's history, and that of the Hills, reflected the fundamental challenges of negotiating to purchase one's freedom. The outcome of such deals rested on two exceedingly difficult things: first, on their enslavers' promises, which were subject not only to changing self-interests, but to the optics of control they needed to display to others whom they enslaved. Second, those eyeing a way out of enslavement needed hefty sums of money, a huge hurdle. Many, like Louisa, had to turn to the charity of abolitionists. Negotiations during slavery took on many forms. Sometimes they were successful. The vast majority were not. It is clear from these stories that enslaved people did all they could to maintain their family units, and they often had to make difficult choices. Understanding these interactions shows the complexities of slavery and the savvy ways enslaved people negotiated their status within the peculiar institution. 6 strategies Harriet Tubman and others used to escape along the Underground Railroad. From elaborate disguises to communicating in code to fighting back, enslaved people found multiple paths to freedom. Despite the horrors of slavery, it was no easy decision to flee. Escaping often involved leaving behind family and heading into the complete unknown, where harsh weather and lack of food might await. Then there was the constant threat of capture. So-called slave catchers and their dogs roamed both sides of the Mason-Dixon line, nabbing runaways and sometimes free black people like Solomon Northup and transporting them back to the plantation, where they would be whipped, beaten, branded, or killed. Yet those willing to brave the risks did have one main ally: the Underground Railroad, a vast, loosely organized network of constantly changing routes that guided black people to freedom. All told, in the decades preceding the Civil War, up to 100,000 black people escaped slavery. Some went to Mexico or Spanish-controlled Florida or hid out in the wilderness. Most, though, traveled to the northern free states or Canada. 1. Getting help. No matter how courageous or clever, few enslaved people threw off their shackles without at least some outside help. Assistance could be as slight as clandestine tips, passed by word of mouth, on how to get away and who to trust. The luckiest, however, followed so-called conductors such as Harriet Tubman, who, after escaping slavery in 1849, devoted herself fully to the Underground Railroad. In about 13 trips back to the eastern shore of Maryland, where she had been brutally mistreated as an enslaved child, Tubman rescued some 70 people, mostly family and friends. Like her fellow conductors, Tubman cultivated a network of collaborators, including so-called station masters, who stashed her charges in barns and other safe houses along the way. Tubman knew the Maryland landscape inside and out, generally following the North Star or rivers that snaked north. She knew which authorities were susceptible to bribes. And she knew how to communicate and gather intelligence without being caught. She would, for example, sing certain songs, or mimic an owl, to signify when it was time to escape or when it was too dangerous to come out of hiding. She also mailed coded letters and sent along messengers. 2. Timing. Over the years, Tubman developed certain extra strategies for keeping her pursuers at arm's length. For one, she usually operated in winter, when longer nights allowed her to cover more ground. She also preferred leaving on Saturday, knowing that no notices about runaways would appear in the newspaper until Monday, since there was no paper on Sunday. Tubman carried a pistol, both for protection and to intimidate those in her care who considered turning back. In addition, she brought drugs with her, using them when a baby's cries threatened to give away her group's position. "I never ran my train off the track," Tubman would later state, "and I never lost a passenger." 3. Disguises and hiding. To return again and again to Maryland, Tubman often relied on disguises, dressing as a man, an elderly woman, or a middle-class free black depending on the situation. Her fellow conductors made similar use of costumes. They might, for example, enter a plantation posing as a slave in order to round up a group of escapees. Conductors also needed disguises, or at least nicer clothes, for the charges in their care. They couldn't very well flee in tattered slave rags without attracting unwanted attention. Some sartorial efforts bordered on genius. In Georgia, a light-skinned enslaved woman posed as an injured white gentleman, with bandages on her face and her right arm in a sling, while her darker-skinned husband pretended to be under her possession. Traveling openly by train and boat, they survived several close calls and ultimately made it to the north. Frederick Douglass likewise escaped slavery hiding in plain sight. Boarding a train dressed as a sailor, he flashed a sailor's protection pass, borrowed from an accomplice, to fool the conductor. Had the conductor looked closely at the paper, Douglass would later write, "He could not have failed to discover that it called for a very different-looking person from myself." By contrast, other runaways took extreme measures to conceal themselves. Desperate to avoid her master's unwanted sexual advances, one enslaved woman hid for 7 years in an attic crawlspace. Another lodged himself inside a wooden crate and shipped himself from Richmond, Virginia, to abolitionists in Philadelphia. 4. Codes, secret pathways. The Underground Railroad scarcely existed in the Deep South, from which very few slaves escaped. Though pro-slavery sentiment wasn't quite as strong in the border states, those who abetted enslaved people there nonetheless faced the constant threat of being ratted out by their neighbors and punished by the authorities. They therefore took great pains to keep their operations secret, which they did, in part, by communicating in code. A station master, for example, might receive a letter referring to incoming fugitives as bundles of wood or a parcel. The word's French leave indicated a sudden departure, whereas patter-roller entailed a slave hunter. On occasion, runaways might use a secret chamber or secret pathway, which would come to epitomize the Underground Railroad in the popular imagination. 5. Buying freedom. For much of its length, though, the Underground Railroad operated openly and brazenly, despite the passage of the 1850 Fugitive Slave Act, which mandated harsh punishments for those found to have aided runaways. Some station masters claimed to have hosted thousands of fugitive slaves and very much publicized their actions. A former enslaved man turned station master in Syracuse, New York, even referred to himself in writing as the city's keeper of the Underground Railroad depot. Meanwhile, so-called stockholders raised money for the Underground Railroad, funding anti-slavery societies that provided ex-slaves with food, clothing, money, lodging, and job placement services. At times, abolitionists would simply buy an enslaved person's freedom, as they did with Sojourner Truth. They also used the courts, suing, for example, to secure the release of Truth's 5-year-old son. Additionally, they fought to change public opinion, financing speeches by Truth and myriad other ex-slaves to bring the atrocities of bondage to light. 6. Fighting. When all else failed, Underground Railroad participants would occasionally form large groups to forcibly liberate fugitive enslaved people from captivity and intimidate slave catchers into returning home empty-handed. Perhaps not surprisingly, John Brown was among those who favored brute force. Prior to his failed revolt in Harper's Ferry, Brown led a group of armed abolitionists into Missouri, where they rescued 11 enslaved people and killed an enslaver. Hotly pursued by pro-slavery forces, Brown then took the fugitives on a 1,500-mile journey through several states, finally depositing them safely in Canada.